We're entering now the 4th week of complete isolation, and if nothing else, it's given us the opportunity to look at the world around us, to contemplate the trees and the birds and the animals. I'm very lucky where I live to be surrounded by some incredibly beautiful trees. If I just look out into the graveyard opposite, we have a terrific example of a British, or more accurately, a European oak. This kind of tree has forged its way into our English, if not British, identity. It was the wood from trees such as these that allowed Henry VIII and Elizabeth I to create one of the greatest navies the world had at that time seen. I thought I'd be vaguely patriotic, as it is St. George's Day this week. But this tree here isn't the only tree, and it's not the only oak tree that we have here at St. Wilfrid's, here in the graveyard, because just across the way from it we have another even bigger tree, a tree that hasn't yet come quite to the same degree of life as the other. But there's a good reason for that, and that is because this is a Turkey oak. Turkey oaks, as the name suggests, are more common to southeastern Europe and Asia Minor. It's different in appearance to our native oak tree. The leaves have slightly pointier lobes, and the acorn cups look as if they're covered in moss with long fronds. The wood of the Turkey oak is not hugely useful, as it tends to split as it dries, and it was introduced into this country in the 18th century for its more ornamental qualities. But there's a third tree, the tree I was sat under whilst recording my Easter Day homily, and it's this tree here. This tree is a very unusual tree, a very rare tree, because this is a weeping beech tree. The weeping beech isn't naturally occurring, it's cultivated, and sections of it have to be grafted onto the roots of other trees. For all its enormous size, this tree was actually only planted here in the 1960s. It was planted too close to the house, so it massively extends on one side more so than the other, which means it's had to develop these enormous great branches to allow it to not fall over. And even though 50 years old, it still bears the signs of the grafting from when it was but a sapling. And I want us to think about these three trees, one which is native to this country, one that is naturally occurring but alien to this landscape, and the other of which was effectively created in a laboratory and which wouldn't exist at all without human interference. Because as I look around the graveyard, as I take in the view, none of them look out of place. None of them look like they don't belong here. And belonging is the fundamental message of the whole of the Bible. It begins with a vision in the Garden of Eden, the vision of Adam and Eve walking with God and talking with him in the evening sunlight. And yet through their willful disobedience of God, they found themselves cast out. The first exodus, the first diaspora, the people who grew spread across the world, taking root in foreign soils and in foreign lands. But despite that, God continues to cultivate his people. He continues to call them to return to him, not just physically, but spiritually. But however much he calls, the story of the Old Testament again is of them wandering off and walking with foreign gods, following their own selfish and self-serving dreams and visions. God had created Israel to be an ensign to the people, to be a beacon of hope, a beacon that reflects his loving presence in the world. But instead, his people grasped at privilege, They grasped at ambition. They grasped at earthly glory and wealth. This was something Jesus very clearly pointed out to them. He, in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, refers to those people as whitewashed sepulchres, beautiful on the outside, but on the inside full of death and corruption. So God took another approach. He foresaw a new Israel made up of branches grafted into the roots that had been already planted. Paul wrote of this in Romans chapter 11. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the rich root of the olive tree, do not vaunt yourselves over the branches. And so here in the Bible story we have three trees. We have the native tree, the tree of Adam and Eve, rooted and grounded in God and in the Garden of Eden. We have the alien tree, the tree that is planted in foreign soil, that takes on nourishment wherever it can. And we have the grafted tree, the one that has been planted into the promises of God. And like those trees out there in the graveyard, they each of them belong, they each of them have their place. It's impossible for us really to see what belongs and what doesn't. Such is the grace and mercy of God that everybody finds in him their own place, the place assigned to them from before the world began. In the lesson set for today, we hear of Thomas, the Thomas who proclaimed Jesus as Lord and God. And in finding Christ, he found also himself. He found himself as a child of God and an heir of God's kingdom. And perhaps we can reflect this week in all the spare time we have as to the fact that despite coming from very different places, despite having very different backgrounds, we all of us belong. We all of us belong in God and with God. We were all of us made to be with God from the very beginning. May we rejoice in the great love, mercy, and grace of the God who calls us to walk with him today. Amen.